Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner with Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Eliot Peper, an author of speculative fiction, whose most recent book, Veil, explores the struggle between different interest groups for control over a clandestine solar geoengineering program. His background includes research on international environmental treaties and building tech startups. And today, when not writing fiction, he provides advice to corporate and government leaders on how to think differently about the future and to create change. Eliot, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, let's dive straight into it. What drove you to write a novel about solar geoengineering or stratospheric aerosol injection, and how did you go about researching the issues it explores?
So normally when I write a novel, it's hard to pin down that spark, that moment of inspiration when I first had the idea for the story. Usually it's a bit blurry and the story sort of comes in over time, and I might have an idea for a character or a theme and then play that out and the book takes shape. But with Veil, I can actually point to a very, very specific moment when I realized I needed to write this book. I was listening to a podcast. It was Tyler Cohen's podcast, and he was interviewing Charles C. Mann, who actually was being interviewed about a wonderful book that I highly recommend called The Wizard and the Prophet.
Oh, I know, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it really changed. Reading it changed the way I look at the world today. But I hadn't read it when I was listening to the podcast. And during their conversation, Charles started describing current research into solar geoengineering. And I had never heard of it before. And it was so fascinating. And when he started talking about some of the trade-offs of what it means to actually engineer the global climate intentionally, whether or not we've been doing it unintentionally so far in other ways, right. I just realized, oh my God, this has to be a novel. There are so many different angles on this kind of a problem. It raises so many questions that impact every area of our lives. So I was sitting there listening to this podcast, realizing I'm going to write a book just solely based on that conversation. And that was really the beginning of a rabbit hole for me. So I immediately read Charles's book, and as any heavy readers who are listening or watching this today probably know, often when you reach the end of a book, authors talk about the other books they read that helped inform it. And so I just kept following that line, and that led me to Oliver Morton's wonderful book, The Planet Remade, and onward from there. So I began reading all the sort of scientific papers on the subject, interviewing different experts on the subject to try to wrap my head around it and figure out where the story was in the material. And that's how I got into it, and that was sort of the Veil's origin story, as it were.
So tell me about the challenges that captured your particular attention. What was it about solar geoengineering that really gave you a sense that this has to be dealt with, this has to be talked about?
Sure. So there were a few. So one is very straightforward. It's that at least the kind of solar geoengineering that is described, that is in the novel, it has, when you make decisions about how you're going to try to engineer the global climate, it's a global decision, right? So I live in California, our state government can't start doing solar geoengineering solely for the purposes of residents of our state without then impacting everyone else on Earth, right? So simply the bifurcation between the way that such a technology would need to be used and how we as humans on this planet make decisions together, they don't line up easily, right? So that was an obvious one. There was obviously a political angle to the story of who gets to decide. If you set this up, who gets to decide how to use it, right? So that was really key. A second element that I found really fascinating and wanted to explore was the more I read about research into the possibility of doing any kind of engineering, including geoengineering, including solar geoengineering, the more I started to the more I started to look at history and the world today differently. So as an example, the book describes people trying to engineer the planet on purpose. But if you look at the history of cars, right? I mean, like, we discovered oil, we started using it in cars. And at the time, it was seen as this amazing thing because most dense human settlements, every city was drowning in horse manure, right? Nobody could figure out how to make a city denser. So it was this miraculous technological innovation that allowed us to live in urban areas in a much more wonderful way. And then over the course of a few decades, we unintentionally engineered the global climate, right? And so suddenly I started looking at the world differently, that there are actually ways in which humans have been geoengineering for centuries. When it comes to agriculture, there are many examples. When it comes to, obviously, the energy system, there are tons of examples there. And we might not have been doing it on purpose, but we have been doing it. And so that really shifted how I understood the world we live in right now as I was writing a book about the near future.
Well, let me pick up that issue of who decides and how do you decide. I mean, in the book, you paint a picture of a rogue program, sort of started in secret, captured by vested interests, and then a bit of a battle over that. But it ends on a more positive note, with international governance and so forth. Do you think a secret program would actually be possible in practice, or is this more of a dramatic tool? And to what extent do you reckon international governance systems could anticipate, overcome these challenges through a more open, inclusive process?
Yeah, that's a big, sticky question. I'd say that I definitely use some dramatic license in making sure that the folks who are in charge of the clandestine program in the novel have the ability to keep it secret, right? So they're sort of, I gave them a bunch of tools to make that more plausible than it otherwise might be. I would say that, one thing that I'm sure that probably many of our listeners are familiar with solar geoengineering, much more so than many of my readers are. And so one thing that I think is different about solar geoengineering versus certain other kinds of sort of technological scenarios you could play out in the James Bond movie in your head or whatever, of what a villain could do, is that, standing up a solar geoengineering program, at least in theory, is really cheap compared to any of these other sort of scenarios you could imagine. And so that opens the field a lot. So when I was interviewing folks about, how would this need to work if it was going to be secret? Or, what are the other ways it could go wrong? I mean, it's very clear that, like, any government on Earth could decide to try this. Their ability to keep it secret would vary by government, but also that because it's cheap and more accessible, it means that you're going to have more heterogeneous groups that might try it, right? So whether or not it's secret, I think it could be very, very messy. Ultimately, if it's messy or secret, you're going to wind up in a situation where you're now, rather than deciding together how to do this right, you wind up in a situation where you're deciding together how to deal with the fact that someone has already started doing it. And the dynamics are quite different. So that was something I gave a lot of thought to.
So obviously one of the challenges of governance and a more open or inclusive kind of way of taking these decisions is that people come from different places, live in different contexts, different countries might have different interests in different outcomes and so on. Do you think it is possible for the world to have a conversation, come to some shared understanding and a sort of a just and fair approach to this?
So my take is that it is possible, but I think it'll take way more time than we normally think. So so let me take that a step further. So we are we've only recently had, like, as a culture, we've only recently had the tools necessary to even like communicate quickly across distance, right? We've only recently had the internet. We've only recently had all of these different things, and so I think we're still trying to get used to it. I think that, like, if you could take a whole batch of headlines from the past 10 years and put it into the category of humanity trying to figure out like how to be in close contact with each other, right? And I think that just like kindergartners need to learn to share and to clean the classroom together after school, right? And like not steal each other's snacks. Like I actually think that there's like a pretty strong parallel to geopolitics, that you have nations that are trying to learn those lessons too. Now, the conflict and collaboration between nations is not new. Obviously, that's been going on since we invented nations. But the thing that is new is that a lot of people within those nations now communicate with each other a lot more directly. Like, I mean, even if you think about a simple example like Netflix, like Squid Game as a Korean show that like takes over the global charts, like that would never have happened 15 years ago. Suddenly we're like the US, I live in California, and both by virtue of the tech industry here and also the entertainment industry in California, there's been this sort of vast global reach of like this strange, weird state on the West Coast of the United States into global culture. But now that's becoming, now we're getting more of that going in many different directions at once. I think that if you take the long view, we're actually all collectively building a more global culture of which we are all a part. And I think that the more that we're able to do that, the more that we're building shared context for which to make governance decisions together more easily. So I think that if we're saying, what will happen next year if we discover that someone has been running a clandestine geoengineering program, I'm worried. But that over the long view, and whenever you're talking about climate change, you better make sure to take the long view. I'm much more optimistic.
Let's imagine there is some system of governance that's put in place. I'm interested in your opinion about public trust in those systems. You know, obviously over the period of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of governance systems work out approaches to deal with it, and yet in certain contexts there's a large number of the public who don't trust this is really being done properly and suspect secret forces at play even if they aren't. And similarly, one might imagine that even in a well governed geoengineering situation, there would still be people who suspect that things are not as they say. How do you see dealing with the issue of public trust in governance these days? And I'm actually wondering whether, to what extent, books like Vale help reinforce a conspiracy narrative, or can they address them?
Okay. Let me take those two questions in reverse order.
Okay.
So first of all, could a story like Vale or any other thriller, right, that has a conspiracy in it, does that reinforce conspiracy narratives? I think it absolutely does for people who believe in conspiracy narratives, right? I mean, 100%. Like it's confirmation bias. So it's a great way to reinforce the fact that you think this is how the world works. But I think that if you zoom out from those people, from that subset, what do speculative fiction, science fiction, these stories that imagine possible futures, what do they do for us as a culture? And Stephen Johnson, the journalist, has this, he popularized this, it's not his idea, but this wonderful idea of the adjacent possible, right? Mm-hmm. That if you imagine in Earth's primordial soup, where you only just had a bunch of molecule, atoms bouncing around, forming molecules, and then those molecules form more complex molecules, and over time you've got these recombinations that form the first life, right? And then that the recombinations of life itself form the multicellular life, and onward and onward. That at any point in time, at any point in human history, there are tools at our disposal in the world we are born into, and that those tools open up a possibility space of what you can do with them to build the next tool or do the next thing, right? And then that changes the world your children or grandchildren are born into. But that space, while vast, is limited. You're limited by the scope of what you're able to do with the tools. Like if I was born 2000 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to write novels on a computer, right? I mean, there's no electricity, that's obvious. And so in my point of view, speculative fiction is sort of this possibility engine. It's a way of exploring the adjacent possible, of thinking, hey, what would the world be like if, right? And that actually can challenge us to think differently. So if I wrote a story about a clandestine, conspiracy-laden geoengineering program, could that inspire some people who want to believe it? Sure, but it's also a warning for people who might be concerned about it, or it's a spark for people who have never thought about this, right? I remember talking to one of the most famous paleontologists in the world today. He discovered the largest, I think, dinosaur that we currently know of in southern Argentina. And I remember him saying that the movie Jurassic Park was, it's obviously totally not technically plausible, but that it was basically the most important work in his field, because every one of his graduate students went into paleontology because they watched Jurassic Park, right? So it's not that it was technically rigorous that makes it powerful in human culture, it's that it inspired people to go work on that set of problems, right? And so from my point of view as a novelist, one of the things that I hope Veil does is spark people's curiosity about these questions, not because I have answers. I don't. I make up stories for a living. I don't know any better than anybody else. But if it makes other people look more deeply and pay more attention, to me, that's a huge win.
You're in some good company now. I don't know the precise ordering of all the novels, but there's also Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future. Neil Stephenson has just come out with Termination Shock. It's almost a subgenre of speculative climate fiction now, dealing with geoengineering questions. Do you think there's any common thread between the questions that are being answered, the sense of where we are now in terms of uncertainty about technology and society, and the size of the climate problem? Why are we seeing all of these come along at the same time, do you think?
Yeah, well, so there are actually many parallels that are both fun but insignificant. Like, for example, if you read Veil, The Ministry for the Future, and Termination Shock. Okay, I'll tell you a little story. So Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote The Ministry for the Future, one of the books you just mentioned, I sent an advanced copy of Veil to him for a blurb, right? Authors all, ask each other to praise their work, right? And so I sent Veil to him for a blurb, and I got an email back. He says, Eliot, I have a new book coming out 6 months after Veil, The Ministry for the Future, that also starts with a global heat wave that kills 20 million people and sparks this solar geoengineering program. And so we wound up going, it led to a wonderful correspondence where it was like, oh, wow, we're reading the same scientific papers, right? And then each, both myself, Neil, and Stan, if you read those books, you can see all the common references, like references to Mount Pinatubo, references to these common threads that if you start learning about solar geoengineering, you'll just see them in every paper or mentioned in every article, right? And they're mentioned in the novels for the same reason. So I sort of think of speculative fiction writers as riffing on reality in the way that a jazz musician would riff on a standard. So rather than trying to predict the future, you're actually trying to just recombine the ingredients that are already in the world in a way that challenges how people see the world right now. And so, yeah, to me, that's sort of a fun common thread that goes through them.
Fiction, by its nature, has to have an element of drama in it, a certain kind of tools you use, like Veil is a thriller, a bit of a family drama. The reality of climate policy might feel a little bit more mundane and incremental. How does fiction portray that world and make that world seem attractive with more,
So that was one of my biggest creative challenges with Veil, was how can I take something that could easily effective as a story devolve right into just a bunch of people arguing with each other, right? And turn that into something that has a narrative drive to it. And that was one of my biggest sort of challenges working on the book. I think that one thing that might be interesting to folks is the difference between stakes and scale. So this is something I think about a lot as a storyteller. So if you think of the latest Hollywood blockbuster you've seen, like the Marvel movies, which I enjoy, right? Like they're super fun. I really enjoy watching them, but they sort of have this trap that the writers have gotten themselves into, which is, well, okay, like you've saved the world, so now you need to save the solar system and then the galaxy, or right? Like you have to keep raising the stakes because otherwise somehow it feels like it's not important enough to deserve a Marvel movie, right? But when I'm working on a story, the thing that really drives it is not stakes, it's not scale. It's not, oh, we're saving the world and then the galaxy. It's stakes. It's what do the characters care so much about, right? Like, what do they care about that they will go to the ends of the earth to try to make it work? That's their quest, right? So like that could be saving the world, but that feels fairly generic. It could also be, popping out to the store to get some milk. I mean, if you cared that much about it. And like a good pop culture example of this is the show Succession just had its season finale. And if you think about that show, it's just about a bunch of kids like basically trying to maneuver around each other over control of a company. But like, who else in the world cares? Nobody. They just really, really care. And that's what drives the drama in the show. So one of the things that I needed to find when I was working on Veil is, who are the people? Who is the kind of person who would care about resolving trying to resolve at least one problem associated with geoengineering in such a deep personal way that it would change them, right? That in questing for that kind, for the thing they wanted, it would show them what they really need out of life. And so that's what I try to think about when I'm grappling with something like, how do I turn this into a story? It's who is the person and why do they care so much about this thing?
So what kind of response did you get with this framing and how you did it from, some of the environmentalists and climate experts that you'd spoken to? What was their reaction to what was finally given back?
Honestly, I've been surprised. I've been really delighted. I mean, they've said nice things. Maybe they're saying that because they're saying it to me, right? But no, I mean, like the response from folks in this field has been overwhelmingly positive, which I was sort of shocked by, because when you're making a piece of art, you're always worried about you want people to like it, right? And so it's been really wonderful and inspiring to see that it resonates with people who know far more about the subject than I ever.
Do you think there's a sense in which some of those people who knew more and who guided, your original research, then got something back in terms of how they felt about the work they were doing, how they were emotionally reacting to the work they were doing?
I hope so. I think that ultimately that's part of what stories can do, right? When I read a novel that really resonates with me, it helps me look at my own life in a new way. It helps me feel more connected to other people, even if they're totally, they're made up, they're fiction, they're fragments of someone's imagination. But you know, when you really connect with someone on a human level through fiction, it can shift the way you see the world and make you feel more connected. And so I hope that that's the case with Veil. And honestly, I hope that, you know, one of the wonderful things about a story like this is, okay, early in our conversation, I mentioned Oliver Morton's The Planet Remade. And everyone, or many people who have started to go down the solar geoengineering rabbit hole, that's a great place to start, because Oliver does such a tremendous job.
I started with it too.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're listening now, and this conversation makes you want to learn more, start there. It's a great place. But the thing with The Planet Remade is that basically the people who read it have already raised their hand intellectually to say, I'm interested enough to learn more, right? Like I picked up a book called The Planet Remade. Like, I'm going to find out what this stuff is all about. So The Planet Remade is perfect for people who are at that point in their lives. But a cool thing about a book like Veil, and not just Veil, like Termination Shock, like The Ministry for the Future, is that these books actually make a very different promise to the reader. The promise to the reader is, I'm going to take you on a journey, right? I'm going to bring you on an adventure, and it's going to be fun, and it's going to be exciting, and we're going to learn stuff. And hopefully, if I've done my job as an author, you're going to want to keep reading. You're not going to be able to stop turning the pages. And then when you finish, it's going to stick with you long after you reach the end, right? Like the ending is going to be surprising, but inevitable, all of those things. And because the promise to the reader is different, you get different readers. So many of my readers have never heard of geoengineering. This is, in fact, probably the interview I've ever done for the novel since it came out, where I actually used the words geoengineering by far the most times, because you know who it is and the audience does, right? But for the most part, my readers, this is totally new to them. They're coming because it's a story. And if it like sparks a little bit of curiosity in just a tiny percentage of them, to me, that's a beautiful thing. And it's a beautiful thing in part because as we are collectively building this big cultural ship, right? Like we need those common metaphors to make sense of the world. Like if you think of George Orwell's 1984, think about having to have a meaningful discussion about state surveillance without being able to use that as a common metaphor. It'd be really hard, right? So fiction can offer that. And I hope that whether it's Termination Shock or Ministry of the Future or any of these other novels that grapple with how the climate is changing and what we could be doing about it, that fiction can help give us the tools to do it right.
On your website, you posted an interview with Stuart Brand, the futurologist, Whole Earth Catalog, famous icon in this area. He famously said, we are as gods and have to get good at it. First of all, do you agree? But secondly, are books like these helping people get to grips with what it would be to be as gods and be good at it?
Yeah, I don't know if I can credibly call Veil a good how-to guide to apotheosis, but I do think Stuart is right. I mean, imagine that you could go back in a time machine and bring someone from the Roman Empire to the present, right? I mean, we have towers of glass and steel that go like so many stories into the sky, right? Like we've used like electrons and sand to make thinking machines that we can have instant communication anywhere on Earth with. We have these flat panels that we spend all day looking at because we've brought them to life. Like, I mean, it's magic. It's like, it's technology, and that's magic, right? And what that means is it gives us power. Instead of spending all day foraging, like I spend all day making up stories and typing them out and sending them to people, right? We right now are talking over Zoom, from totally different sides of the world. And then, you explained to me before we started the interview that not only will this just be distributed globally on the internet, you're going to translate it into many different languages and make it available, right? Like all of this is incredible, but it also means that the second and third order effects of anything we do are extraordinary. Instead of throwing little pebbles into the pond, we're throwing boulders now. And so if you throw a boulder and expect it to create the ripple of a pebble, you're in trouble. And I think that's what Stewart is really getting at. And one of the really core themes in Vale that the hero grapples with is that often we look at the world and we see all of these problems, right? Read the headlines. It's just a list of these huge problems that feel so big. How do we find any traction at all with them, right? And I think that the tension that she tries to sort of transcend in herself over the course of this story is that those problems are inevitable, right? You bring in cars and you solve the problem of horse manure and allow cities to grow again, and then you create the problem of climate change, right? So these problems will keep happening. There's no end game, right? That you're just always going to have more problems, and also that these problems are soluble, right? We did solve the problem of manure in cities. We just invented a new one for ourselves. And I think that often internally we have this emotional tension where we want the world to just work, right? We want the solution that doesn't create a new problem. And I think that is what is beyond our grasp. And so instead, what we need to do is look at the world in a clear-eyed way, create the best solutions we possibly can without pretending that they're not going to have consequences that we didn't expect. And I think that's part of what Stewart is getting at.
And you've also touched in your answer on the question I was going to close with. It's a lot of us working in this field, and generally people, learning and writing about the enormity of the climate crisis, is huge problems, really start to face issues of anxiety, despondency, grief, and this is emerging as a serious challenge as to how we, as a community, help solve this problem, if such a thing is possible. Solving is an interesting word sometimes, but what are the tools? You spend a lot of time looking into this. It is somewhat bleak sometimes when you sort of follow through the threads. How do you personally find, maintain a sense of agency and hope? And how do you think that, without underplaying the actual size of the problem and the inevitability of these issues, how do you, do you think wider society can actually tackle these senses of grief and maintain a sense of agency and hope?
So Vale actually starts with the main character losing a parent, and what you just said is why. There is this, we have this grief for how the world is changing in all of these unexpected ways that we don't want, and at our own appearing inability to do anything about it, right? And I think everybody can connect with this, right? Like whenever in your personal life, whether it's like something happens in your family and you want to help that person, right? But there's nothing you can do. Like, that they need to make that change for themselves or whatever it is, right? That's a core part of being human. And I think that it's such a dangerous trap when it comes to people who are working on problems of the size of the climate crisis, right? It can be overwhelming. And so the way that I try to handle that, because I feel, I'm using different tools than a climatologist might, or that a policymaker might, but like as a storyteller, as a novelist, I am deeply interested in these problems, and I'm trying to find a way to contribute, right? And so I have those same feelings. And the thing that I find helpful personally is twofold. One, whenever I start to feel that despondency, that just sort of like blanket grief, I look for ways to do very, very practical things for people in my life. So like that might be a friend, it might be a stranger, it might be like I get an email from, I don't know, a student who wants to be a writer and they don't even know what question to ask, right? But like I'll actually respond with like like I'll spend a lot of time trying to basically do a favor for a stranger, right? And I find that because dealing with something like the climate crisis is so big and in some ways abstract, right? It's something that is happening in our imagination. We're experiencing the effects of it concretely, right? Like I live in California, we are choked by smoke every summer from wildfires, but the solutions are much more abstract. And so finding practical ways to do something to improve, make someone else smile in my life is actually extremely helpful. And it's even more helpful when I pair it with something we already touched on in this conversation, which is that that we are like the human lifespan is a totally arbitrary number, right? Like we're not alive for that long. I mean, if you look at the geological time scale, it's like not even a blink of an eye, right? I mean, if you look at from a mayfly's perspective, we live forever. But that when we're talking about things like the climate crisis, that's a huge scale problem that will be playing out for a long time, regardless of how what we do about it. And so it's really helpful to remember that we're all still trying to figure it out, right? Like it may feel like it's been going on forever, but in fact, like if you look at any other big problem that like human civilization has been faced with, we're reacting faster than anyone ever has, right? To basically anything. And we have new tools at our disposal to do so. So I think that I find that to be a source of hope because I'm not worried about the planet. Like I am worried about real people who are living in specific places on the planet and are in terrible situations that this will make worse. But I'm not worried about the planet itself over a long time scale. And I have a lot of confidence that as our culture starts to process this set of problems, we will invent new ways of solving them. But what that means is that if I believe that, I can't then come around and blame myself for not having invented it yesterday, right? Like that's not how this is going to work. It's going to take like all of us over the course of generations to do this right and to figure out the right path forward.
On that note, Eliot Peper, thank you so much for being a guest on C2GTalk.
Thanks so much for having me.